Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Jijon and Francisco Vintimilla wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions. However, this is our first time reviewing one of their extra light offerings, as this is a coffee that I was going to purchase regardless, but it did add to my interest seeing this one offered as an extra light option as well. For anybody that's unaware, we did review the initial release of both the Finca San Pedro and the Finca Surya earlier this year from SAME, and a lot of people were asking if we were going to be reviewing the second release of those coffees as well. And I said the main reason that we weren't going to was because I was waiting to review it from a different coffee roaster. So I was very excited to see September offering this coffee as well. But interestingly enough, this is technically neither the Finca San Pedro or the Finca Surya. It's actually a mix of the two. But seeing it offered from one of my favorite Canadian coffee roasters and in an extra light profile definitely caught my interest. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 56. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So we've already discussed in depth that this one is an extra light coffee, but to try to quantify and scale this one, it's kind of interesting to think about it and see some of the feedback we've had, as Lance Hedrick did a little bit of a comparison with this specific coffee alongside some coffees from the Picky Chemist. And I feel like this coffee and this roast style is actually heavily influenced by the Picky Chemist based off of that, as well as a brief conversation that we did have with Kyle. And you can definitely see that this is an extremely light coffee, and it's almost at the level of some of the Picky Chemist's offerings as well, which is to say that it's an extremely light coffee. It's on par with any of the lightest roasted coffees we've had in North America in general, even if not necessarily quite that same extremely light standard as some of those super light roasting coffee roasters out there in Europe. So all of this to say, it's extremely light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 30, first impression. And we did run this one through the V60, and as expected, it came out very tame and delicate, and for a number of reasons, that's fully what I was expecting with this coffee, as it definitely is an indication of the very light profile of it in general. It does have shades of the Finca Surya from SAME, but in a significantly lighter sense, as well as a slight bit of sweetness in the finish, but for the most part, a softer florality and a soft brightness to the cup. So a lot of this was soft, fully expected based off what we had expected from this coffee in general. Day 33 through the Chemex, and pretty similar results, as it's reminiscent of experiences we've had with super light profiled Mejorado coffees in the past. Most notably, I'm thinking of the one that we had from H&S, the Arashi, which at times did feel a little bit more subtle and tame in terms of the overall intensity to it, especially in regard to the sweetness. Still slightly generic, with the primary component being a soft florality. So as of this moment, we're kind of working through this coffee, as I fully expected there to be a little bit of a tinkering period, especially this early on. Day 36 through the April brewer, and it's a little different this time around. A little bit more intensity to the cup, but it is skewing a little bit more in the citric direction as well. A little bit more tart with a bright but softer and pronounced berry profile to the cup. It does offer a slight graham cracker-like sweetness in the cool down, so it's just been a little different altogether. This one's a little bit of an anomaly relative to the first couple of experiences we had. Day 39 through the V60 with lower temperatures, and here's where things got kind of interesting, because I feel like conventional wisdom and most people would decide to really push this one, but it's once again that kind of tricky thing where our previous experiences with Mejorado coffees have yielded itself towards better results with toning the coffee down in terms of the overall extraction, whereas most people, once again, given the profile of this coffee, would go in the opposite direction. So I said, you know what, we have so much experience with Mejorado coffees, maybe a little bit too much, let's try this first. And it did improve. There was significantly more sweetness, once again in that slight graham cracker-like sense. The rest of the profile remained soft, but a little bit more intensity to the floral sense, and it was significantly better all around, mostly because there just was a little bit more intensity, and the early impressions of this coffee were just so soft, light, and tame. Day 42 through the Chemex, and it is also improved from some of the earlier days, but not quite as lively as the previous day, with a little bit more softness in the floral sense. It continues to feel like a graham cracker-like sweetness with a nicely structured palm fruit brightness. If I recall correctly, I do think they have something along the lines of an apple or a pear listed on here, and I can see that regardless, as it does have that palm fruit brightness to it. Day 45 through the V60 with slightly higher extraction adjustments. So we went from toning it down all the way to 93, all the way up to 95 in terms of degrees Celsius. And there was a little bit more improvement relative to the previous days, but the cup in general continued to remain pretty light, with the entirety being a little bit more on the subtle, softer fruit side. There's a little bit more structure to it, with the listed red berries becoming a little bit more pronounced, but still plenty more of that palm fruit brightness. And on day 48, we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments. And this is an interesting day, as I feel like the coffee finally hit a switch. So I feel like if a lot of people are asking, how long should I let this coffee rest? And I think the instructions for this one were a 30-day period. Honestly, I think this day 48 mark is when the coffee did finally seem to switch, because we've been making small adjustments and tinkering with this one ever so slightly, but this is the first time where I could say the coffee is actually pretty well structured. It's pretty intense. You're getting plenty of the flavor profile and prominence to this one, especially in terms of the brightness, as it is offering much more of those palm fruit aspects this time around, and a sweeter honeysuckle-like aspect to it as well. So this was significantly better in so many regards. So as a result, I noticed just a pretty significant shift, even with just very small adjustments that we'd been making to this coffee. Day 51, last try through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and once again, it's the best it's been. Here on this day 56 mark, it's still along the same lines, and it does lend itself towards an interesting question. Is this coffee going to be just as good with our other brew methods if we had opted for the V60? It just seems like that the Chemex benefited from us finding the best of this coffee on this specific day, mostly because this is the time where it felt like the coffee just finally opened up in general. Most amount of sweetness in the cool down, the most amount of it in general up to this point, plenty of it as well, with a mostly soft florality and a sugar forward aspect to the cup as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the sweetness level 5. So that's kind of interesting. And we are working with a Mejorado coffee, and usually when it comes to those coffees, I am scoring them at a level 5. As I was thinking about this one, I said, this one actually might skew a little bit away from that. It's still sweet enough to justify that level 5, maybe a slightly lower side of level 5. But I think that the overall profile of this one being as light as it was may have taken away from that slightly and offered a little bit more definition and clarity in place of that. Even then, I do have to say that the sweetness is pretty notable, pretty abundant, and much more pronounced than the average coffee in general. By Mejorado standards, which have very high standards for sweetness, perhaps slightly lower than that. We have a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And when I was thinking about this tasting wheel, I said to myself, this is perhaps one of the cleanest Mejorado coffees that I've ever had, which is probably the nice selling point to this coffee in general, as it just has exceptional clarity. I can't justify the level 5 mark, mostly because it still has kind of some of those factors that might take away from it. A very slight savory aspect to it, a very slight, tart berry aspect to it as well. But outside of that, it still has such tremendous clarity, making it one of the cleanest Mejorado coffees that we've ever reviewed as well. And it's kind of interesting because the Arashi we had from H&S also went in that direction, as it felt very clean. So I feel like the super light profile to these coffees definitely seems to help with that aspect. Finish, level 4. And it definitely has a little bit of that sugary finish to it, a little bit of that Mejorado-like finish in this one. And given that, as you kind of look at this tasting wheel, there isn't anything else that's maybe a little bit more pronounced within this coffee in general. That's what's kind of interesting about the overall flavor profile of it. Since it's still relatively soft, a lot of the things that are scoring higher on this tasting wheel are scoring higher because the base of this coffee is just as clean as it is and delicate as it is. So level 4 mark is kind of insinuating a little bit more of the sugary tones to it. Let's continue along the lines of those level 4s, and we'll go to the florality level 4. Truth be told, I cannot remember what the flavor notes of this coffee were, and let's see here. Apple, red berry, white florals. White florals makes a lot of sense. There are plenty of floral aspects within this coffee, especially in a little bit more of a sweeter sense. So on the final day, I said a little bit more along the lines of a honeysuckle. Towards the earlier days, it was a little bit more of a generic florality, though still plenty of floral components to this one. So happy with that, scoring at that level 4 mark. Citrus fruit, level 4, and a lot of that is representative of the, we'll say, palm fruit aspects, so the listed apple component on there. Obviously, the best place to put it is there on that mark, which does kind of transition into level 3s. And we'll begin with the acidity level 3. And I think what I've kind of decided when it comes to the acidity, the brightness of coffees, is that if it has the same level of what you'd expect from an average Kenyan coffee, then that's where I'm going to place that at a 4, unless it's really, really close. I don't necessarily think that the brightness in this coffee was overly abundant, but that's on par with what I've experienced from Mejorado coffees in general, where the brightness to them isn't necessarily the most prominent or the most highlighted factor of these coffees. So staying there at that level 3 is a little bit more in line with the average experience we have for Mejorado coffees. Berry fruit, level 3. And once again, they have red berries listed on here, and I can see it. Some of the Pepe coffees we've had in the past have actually had a little bit more of those red berry tones to them. This one, though, coming a little bit more in a subtle sense, and at times slightly tart as well. Caramel level 3, and that's plenty of the Mejorado sweetness that's present within this one. Comes a little bit in that brown candy sense, but honestly a little bit more on a sugary sense. Nonetheless, it is a Mejorado coffee. We still get plenty of sweetness from it in that regard. And then final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 3, and I think that might have surprised me ever so slightly given the profile of this coffee being as light as it is, but it definitely still had a little bit more texture to it, because once again, Mejorado coffees don't necessarily always tend to have the most body in general. So saying this one scored a little bit higher in the body does give it a little bit of an added layer to it, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. At its very best, it's very, very good. And that's what I continuously say about these extremely light profiled Mejorado coffees. When you get them at their very best, they are just as good, if not better, than the vast majority of Mejorado coffees that we do review. And I'm immediately thinking back to that Arashi from H&S, because I think that one was a really good introductory into what happens when you do something overly light with one of these Mejorado coffees. And this one is very reminiscent of that, because that one at times was a little bit more up and down. This one seemed to be going up throughout the entirety of the time that we were drinking it. Like, the slight adjustments did seem to help, but I feel like the coffee honestly just needed a little bit more time and patience, because now here on this day 56 mark, it's the best it's been. I feel like this coffee is actually going to continue to improve, maybe incrementally day by day, but there really was a switch that flipped on that, what was it, day 46 mark, where the coffee went from being a little bit too soft and tame to finally offering much more intensity, but at the same time still plenty of that clarity that we had experienced, that softness that we had experienced from the earlier days, kind of giving this a very interesting combination of factors. I'm not sure how the non-extra light version of this coffee might have turned out, but as far as this version of the coffee turned out, I think I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I'm very curious to see what happens, not just with this coffee in the future, but also with more of September's extra light offerings. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Obviously, since the main talking point of this coffee has been the profile of it, let's start with that. If you do like your extremely light coffees, then this one is very much on line with a lot of those expectations, because it does offer such great clarity, that really nice kind of softer aspect to the coffees, and it is complemented well by a lot of the other tones, a lot of those Mejorado characteristics to it, most distinctly the sweetness, and in addition to that, just a cleaner profile to the fruits that are a little bit more subtle, but at the same time the florality, which can come out very nice. Couple that with plenty of the lingering Mejorado characteristics, as well as a little bit more body to it, and that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try the coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Jose Jijon and Francisco Vintimilla wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.